The battle for Pork Chop Hill. Filipino blood on unforgiving terrain. What if I told you one of the most brutal battles of the Korean War, a savage fight for a worthless piece of land, was defined by the almost forgotten courage of a small band of Filipino soldiers? This is the untold story of Pork Chop Hill, where heroes were forged in blood and fire. The year is 1953. The Korean War has been raging for 3 long, bloody years. The world powers are locked in a bitter stalemate, a grinding war of trenches and artillery that chewed up men and spit out mud-filled craters. Peace talks were happening, but on the front lines, the fighting was more desperate than ever. Each side wanted to grab as much land as possible to have a stronger hand at the negotiating table. And in the middle of this unforgiving meat grinder was a place called Hill 255. To the American soldiers dug in there, it had a different name: Pork Chop Hill. It wasn't a mighty mountain or a strategic fortress. It was a barren, treeless lump of dirt and rock exposed to the enemy on 3 sides. It had no real strategic value. So why would thousands of men fight and die for it? Because in war, even a worthless hill can become a symbol. It was a test of will, a brutal question of who would break first. Holding a sector of this volatile front line was the 10th Battalion Combat Team of the Philippine Expeditionary Forces to Korea, or PEFTOK. These weren't just any soldiers. These were men who carried the warrior spirit of their grandfathers who had fought for freedom for generations. They were volunteers, thousands of miles from their sunny homes, fighting in a harsh, frozen land. They had already earned a reputation for their fierce fighting skills, but they had no idea that their greatest test, their defining moment of heroism and sacrifice, was waiting for them on that God-forsaken hill. They were about to be thrown into the very heart of the storm. Chapter 2. The Dragon's Fury. On the night of April 23, 1953, all hell broke loose. The Chinese forces, determined to seize the hill, unleashed a firestorm of artillery. For hours, thousands of shells rained down on the Filipino positions, turning the already scarred landscape into a churning cauldron of fire, steel, and death. The ground shook so violently it felt like the world was ending. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of twisted metal. It was a bombardment designed to shatter bodies and break minds before the first enemy soldier even showed their face. And then they came. Out of the darkness, a human tide surged up the slopes of Pork Chop Hill. The Chinese army used a terrifying tactic, the human wave assault. Thousands of soldiers, blowing bugles and whistles to create chaos and fear, charged forward, not in neat lines, but like a relentless flood, expecting to simply overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. For the Filipino soldiers of the 10th BCT, peering out from their shattered trenches, it was a nightmare come to life. Holding the most forward outpost, a position called Old Baldy, was Lieutenant Agos Jr. and his platoon. They were outnumbered, some say by more than 10 to 1. But they were not broken. As the waves of enemy soldiers crashed against their defenses, the Filipinos answered with a fury of their own. Their machine guns glowed red hot, cutting down attackers, but for every one that fell, 2 more seemed to take their place. The fighting quickly devolved into a savage hand-to-hand struggle in the darkness. It was a desperate brawl with rifles, bayonets, and grenades in the claustrophobic confines of the trenches. The Chinese were relentless, flooding the Filipino lines, getting closer and closer to overrunning them completely. The desperate calls for backup crackled over the radio, but the intense shelling made it almost impossible for reinforcements to reach them. Can you even imagine the terror of being surrounded by an overwhelming force in the dark? Let me know in the comments below what you would be thinking in that moment. Seriously, I want to know. Trapped and surrounded, with enemy soldiers pouring into their trenches from all sides, Lieutenant Agos and his handful of Filipino defenders had only two choices left: surrender or fight to the very last man. Their stand on this forgotten hill was far from over. Chapter 3. Blood for blood. This was it, the breaking point. The Filipino trenches were no longer a defensive line. They were a swirling vortex of brutal hand-to-hand combat. Enemy soldiers were everywhere, leaping over sandbags, fighting with a terrifying ferocity. For Lieutenant Agos and his men, it wasn't about holding a position anymore. It was about surviving the next 30 seconds. Every corner of the trench, every dugout became a small, desperate battlefield. They were fighting for their lives, for their brothers next to them, fueled by pure adrenaline and raw courage. But courage alone can't stop a tidal wave. The radio crackled with desperate pleas, but the lines kept getting cut. They were being squeezed, choked off, and systematically wiped out. Lieutenant Agos saw his platoon being torn apart. He knew that in a few minutes they would all be dead or captured. He had to make an impossible choice, a decision that goes against every instinct of a soldier. He had to gamble with his own lives to save them. He scrambled to another radio set and grabbed the handset. His message was chilling and desperate, a soldier's final, defiant roar against impossible odds. He screamed into the radio, not to his immediate commander, but to the American artillery batteries miles away. The message was simple and terrifying. He screamed, "Fire on my position." Can you even comprehend that? To call down a storm of high explosive shells directly on top of yourself and your friends. It's an act of unimaginable bravery. If this story is hitting you as hard as it hits me, please take a second to hit that like button to honor the sheer guts of these soldiers. The American commanders, trusting the desperate plea, unleashed hell. The big guns roared, and seconds later, tons of steel and high explosives crashed down on the outpost. The barrage was a double-edged sword, a storm of friendly fire meant to wipe the slate clean. For the Filipino defenders huddled at the bottom of their foxholes, it was the most terrifying moment of their lives, praying that American accuracy would spare them, while annihilating the enemy swarming just feet above them. The ground heaved, and the sky turned into a continuous blinding flash. When the shelling finally stopped, an eerie silence fell over the shattered hilltop. The human wave had been broken. The cost was horrifying, but the Filipino soldiers of the 10th BCT were still there. Chapter 4. The Price of Victory. As the sun rose on the morning of April 24th, it revealed a scene of utter devastation. The ferocious artillery barrage, the gamble that had saved them, had also obliterated their battlefield. The once clear lines of trenches were now just jagged scars in the earth. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the grim, metallic scent of battle. But amidst the ruin, something incredible had happened. The Philippine flag, or what was left of it, still fluttered over the outpost. The position had held. The cost, however, was staggering. Out of the initial platoon defending the forward position, only a handful of men were left standing. Lieutenant Agos, the young officer who had made the impossible call, was seriously wounded but alive. His men were battered, bleeding, and emotionally scarred, but they had refused to break. They had stared into the abyss and spat in its eye. As reinforcements finally fought their way up the hill, they were met not by cheers of victory, but by the grim, quiet resolve of the survivors. The battle for Porkchop Hill would rage on for days, with American and other UN forces being thrown into the grinder. But the initial, ferocious assault, the one that came closest to shattering the UN line, had been stopped cold by this small band of Filipino warriors. Their stand had bought precious time, allowing reinforcements to prepare and blunt the massive Chinese offensive. They had been the rock upon which the first and most
powerful wave had broken. For the men of the 10th Battalion Combat Team, it was a victory paid for in blood. Official records would list the casualties: 14 killed, 38 wounded, and several missing. But those numbers don't tell the full story. They don't describe the terror of the human wave, the agonizing decision to call fire upon themselves, or the courage it took to keep fighting when all hope seemed lost. They had held the line. They had paid the price. And in doing so, they had earned the respect and admiration of all who fought alongside them. Their sacrifice would echo long after the guns fell silent. Chapter 5: A Legacy of Courage. The guns of the Korean War fell silent just a few months after the brutal fighting on Pork Chop Hill. An armistice was signed, and the battle lines became a heavily fortified border that still exists today. Hills like Pork Chop were left to the wind and the ghosts of the brave men who fought and died there. In the grand narrative of the war, a conflict involving millions of soldiers and dozens of nations, the story of one Filipino platoon on one bloody night could easily have been forgotten, a footnote in a history book. But it wasn't forgotten, not by the men who survived it, and not by the American commanders who witnessed their incredible bravery. The story of Lieutenant Egas and his men became a legend within military circles, a shining example of courage under fire. For his actions, Lieutenant Egas was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross by the United States, one of the highest honors for valor. His men were also decorated, their heroism officially recognized. They had traveled thousands of miles to fight for a country that wasn't their own, for the ideal of freedom, and had proven themselves to be among the finest soldiers in the world. Today, the legacy of the 10th Battalion Combat Team and their stand on Pork Chop Hill lives on. It's a testament to the incredible bravery that can be found in the most desperate of moments. It's a story of sacrifice, of a bond between brothers in arms forged in the crucible of combat. It's a powerful reminder that heroes aren't always the ones with the most medals or the biggest headlines. Sometimes, they are just a small group of ordinary men from a tropical land who, when faced with an impossible choice on a frozen, unforgiving hill, chose to fight. They chose to stand. They chose to be heroes. The story of the battle for Pork Chop Hill is a testament to the human spirit. If the courage of these forgotten heroes inspired you, please subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories from military history. Comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to hit that like button. Your support helps us keep these vital stories alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you so much also for subscribing, liking, and commenting to our videos. God bless us all.